Yes, good morning everyone. My name is Matt Jones and I'm an Associate Landscape Architect at Isthmus based in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. It gives me great pleasure to provide this introduction for Kristina here this morning. Little background, so Kristina is currently an Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture and Environmental Planning and Urban Design at the University of California, Berkeley. She is a Bachelor of Science, magna cum laude in Geology, Master of Landscape Architecture with distinction, and a PhD in Landscape Architecture and Ecology from Harvard University. Kristina provides design expertise and strategic advice to clients who are seeking to adapt to challenges associated with climate change while strengthening biodiversity and social justice. After Hurricane Katrina in 2005, she became a member of the Dutch-American engineering and design team that developed New Orleans' water management strategy. She continues to collaborate internationally and to understand the potential for designs to help protect coastal communities as sea levels rise. Kristina typically works on multidisciplinary teams, working on strategies for adaptation through urban infrastructure design. She currently focuses her research on adaptation and coastal design in the San Francisco Bay Area, but engages comparative studies in the US, Mid-Atlantic, Europe, and Hawaii, and from Hughes mentioned this morning, has done some work down here in Christchurch. Kristina has written a book, Ecology and Design, Frameworks for Learning, which was published in 2002 and is currently working on another project around urban waterfronts and climate change. So with this knowledge, determination, and shared experience of this caliber, I'm intrigued into Kristina's take on how designers grapple disruption. So please join me in giving a round of applause and a warm welcome to Associate Professor Kristina Hill.
It's a privilege to have a chance to come back to New Zealand and back to Christchurch. I learned so much on my first visit here. And I just want to, give you a heads up in the beginning that, like Julie Bargman, I think of using swears as a sign of respect for the audience. Where Julie and I come from, that's how you tell people you're sincere. If you don't occasionally swear, you must be some salesperson. So that's what's happening. Just so you know, we are showing respect. I also wanted to point out that I'm always inspired coming to New Zealand to hear how much you're doing to bring a relationship back between the Maori people, who are so important to this landscape and these cities and the future of New Zealand, and the more imported population, the great diaspora of European and Asian peoples. So I'm always impressed by that, and I wanted to point out that I know that we're 50 years behind you in so many ways in the United States on that issue. But the Green New Deal, the architects of the Green New Deal, that was originally the idea of Winona LaDuke, who's an Ojibwe activist in the United States who ran for vice president on a ticket with Ralph Nader. So I just wanted to point that out. We're going to be talking a lot about Green New Deals, and I want to be clear that that's an Ojibwe idea. So I did my hair for you. I wanted to bring a little red flag notice with me. That's what we call it in the Bay Area now when we're having our fire weather. And it's kind of like an opera that repeats with all the drama and fear, unfortunately, actual loss of life and loss of property every fall now. And it's become such a part of our lives that I feel like every talk I give should somehow indicate how we are actually being changed by these repeating floods and repeating fires. Because people's economic lives, their psychology, everything, their politics is being transformed by this over time. So I wanted to start with a picture of that. I considered making the whole talk about that, and then I thought, it's nice, but I'm not really an expert at that. So what I wanted to share with you is more the fact that given the carbon emissions, I'm going to talk a little bit about some shared baseline issues. I don't know what the conversation is here about sea level rise, and I think it's important to check in on some basics. So our current level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is well beyond anything that humans have ever been present to witness before. And we're basically on a new planet from a human species point of view already. And now we're waiting to see what that means. So The horse has left the barn. We are on the new planet, and the question now is, how quickly can we stabilize our situation? As I was invited to talk about disaster, I thought I would do a little, I'm always happy to hear, the word check. What do we really mean by these terms that we're using? And I thought about disaster and its origins in referring to being under an ill star, and compared that to some other words we could use. Cataclysm, which is Greek for down and wash, washing down in a way that's obviously negative, but involves a serious kind of change. And then these graphs next to it are the frequency of mentions of that term in literature that's been studied by the Oxford English Dictionary. And then calamity is not used very often anymore, but it refers to a really old Latin word for injury or distress. And then crisis, of course, is from the Greek word for decision or turning point, and used to refer to a turning point in a disease. It was a medical term used in 17th century Europe to talk about disease. And the one that I've chosen, because I don't think the situation I'm describing is about being under an ill star, the one that I've chosen is cataclysm, because the things we're talking about in relation to flooding are truly about getting washed. We are going to get washed, and we need to think about what that's going to be like. Over the last 24,000 years, as someone with a geology degree, you're always going to see slides like this in my presentations, because geologic time is the only really meaningful time. Over the last 24,000 years, we've seen really rapid sea level rise, and it's only been the last 8,000 years, this little happy period of slow sea level rise in which the human species has developed cities. So we've never managed or operated or designed cities for one of these phases of rapid sea level rise, like Meltwater Pulse 1A, which is the super fast era that everyone's worried we're going to see a repeat of, depending on how the major ice sheets of the world in Greenland and in the Antarctic continent, how they melt. So we don't know which kind of piece of this graph we're on, but I can tell you we're not on the one we've been on for the last 8,000 years. The last time anybody dealt with a really rapid sea level rise and what the consequences were of living in that new world was in the Sumerian Empire about 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, when some of the first cities in the world were founded in the delta of the Tigris and the Euphrates. And those deltas exist all around the world only because sea level became stable, and the conveyor belt of sediment bringing sediment to the coast stayed in one place and built those deltas. So cities and deltas go together, and they go with a gradual, very slow rate of sea level rise. The Sumerians had a whole cosmology around groundwater, which is going to be the theme of my talk today, underground, hidden water, and their belief was that people come from groundwater and then go back to groundwater when they die. So I thought that was a kind of beautiful metaphor for what we're going to be going through ourselves. We may want to suddenly get back in touch with Sumerian cosmology because that's coming. So this is the advice the state of California is giving to public agencies about sea level rise. And I've put in a 1 meter line there for speaking cross-culturally from feet to meters. And the extreme version of this might be a meter by 2050 something, might be a meter by 2070, might be a meter by 2096. And I'll compare this to what the New Zealand guidance is in just a couple slides. But what this says to me is, we don't really know which one of these trend lines we're on, but we sure are on one. We have bought a ticket, and we are on the ride. This is a roller coaster that was pulled off of a pier by Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey in 2012. And it's a useful kind of image for talking about, well, what roller coaster have we bought a ticket for? And the fact that we don't know which ride we're on, but we know that a lot of change is coming. And even small amounts of sea level rise are the difference between life and death, occupation and not occupation for people who live along the coast. The fundamental argument about whether we're on one roller coaster ride or another comes down to how ice melts. When I was an undergraduate, I studied glacial geology. I thought it was truly off the beaten path. My parents thought I was crazy. What would I ever do with that? And now that's all I read to try to understand what's happening here and which roller coaster ride we're committed to. On the left, you can see the gentle roller coaster, which the idea is that ice shelves will protect the thicker part of the ice sheet from rapidly breaking and calving off, and that ice shelves will continue to melt back with the face of the ice sheet in a gradual way. And on the right, you see marine ice cliff instability, which is the idea that that shelf is going to melt, and then the steep face of the ice sheet will be exposed and come off in big skyscraper-sized chunks and can retreat very, very rapidly. And if we're going to get 3 meters or 2 meters of sea level rise in the next 80 years, it's going to be because that thing on the right starts happening. And there are two stories here, gradual and catastrophic. And in geology, one of the first things you learn in Geology 101 is that that's what history has been a combination of. It's never either or, it's always both. So that's likely to be where we're going to find ourselves looking back at this discussion 20, 30, 50 years from now. It's going to be both. And that means something like the medium, potentially even the high rate of sea level rise. So let me compare what New Zealand's guidance is with what California's is. On the left, you see the New Zealand guidance from the 2017 national study that talks about potentially 1 meter of sea level rise in the worst case at 2095. In the worst case. And we're talking about 1 meter of sea level rise 45 years earlier in 2054 as our worst case. So you can see we're planning for something much more dramatic. And I think that's partly because the US didn't participate much officially in the IPCC climate change process, although our academics certainly did. We're starting from a different point of view, which is looking at the data from Antarctica and from Greenland and saying, okay, this looks bad. Let's consider the possibility that the catastrophic thing can happen and start planning our major investments, billions of dollars in coastal adaptation. We have a long coast also, in relation to what future generations are going to experience, and take some responsibility for what we've done and spend some money to prepare future generations. So that's one of the intergenerational issues involved in what number you pick. Are you doing something now, or are you waiting for them to have to do something 80 years from now? So that's one of the reasons. That's the best interpretation I can give of why that's there. And what it makes everybody think is, oh my gosh, this is really going to happen? We can't believe it. And the issue isn't that we fight over it. I mean, notice the solution was to float, which I will get to. The solution may be, in fact, to float. You don't want to be the one who gets left behind on the floating, though. You want to be part of the conversation and part of adaptation. At the same time, we triple down on mitigation. We've got to get to zero carbon globally by 2050. Zero carbon globally by 2050. Now, I believe New Zealand can do that. Do you believe that China and India and the United States will do that? So, get on the boat. Let's talk about groundwater, which I think is the special sauce of this whole adaptation conversation, and something that could make what we're talking about in the Bay Area for our adaptation price tag for our shoreline is something in between $58 and $150 billion just for the coastline of the San Francisco Bay, which is about 1,000 miles long. Let's talk about groundwater and how it might make that investment totally useless. So groundwater is that water you find when you dig down at the beach and you find water in the sand. That's often fresh water on its way to the ocean. It sits a little bit above the salt water. This is the kind of groundwater that just fills the pore spaces in soil. It's not deep groundwater buried under big layers that you can use for drinking water. It's shallow groundwater that is dirty often in urban areas, and so we don't keep track of it. I tell the Dutch colleagues we have that, American groundwater is wild groundwater. We don't know where it is, we don't know what it's like, we don't know where it's going. Dutch groundwater is domesticated groundwater. They know where it is. In fact, they make laws that say where it has to be. That would never occur to us. So this is the groundwater we're talking about, and it is rising. So why is it rising? You probably haven't heard much about this. This is a really big deal. This is an existing condition kind of section for a section along the San Francisco Bay. We have things you have too. We have a saltwater saturated zone in the groundwater below the saltwater ocean water. We have a freshwater groundwater saturated zone, top of which we call the water table, same as you. That water sits in ways that are exposed, like that little lagoon section. It goes under levees, it goes under seawalls. And as it comes up, it's going to challenge that thin crust of urbanization that we've built with pipes in seismic regions like ours and like yours. Those pipes are often cracked, and groundwater can fill the joints. We have hazardous materials in the soil. We have building foundations. As the sea rises, it pushes the lighter fresh water up. Honest, really. The US Geological Survey says this, not just me. And it's going to go into those sewer pipes and take up all the capacity that they have, unless they've been sealed. We're going to have to actually put foundations in things that are underground, concrete-lined channels and pipes. It's going to challenge building foundations, potentially disrupting or disturbing them, and it's going to potentially remobilize any hazardous materials we've left in the soil that could come into contact with that water. Even just a weekend of high water can mobilize contaminants in the soil that cause cancer for someone else. This is a very, very sensitive and important discussion about what's going to happen with this. And notice that it rises under the levee and behind it. Levees don't stop this from happening. This is a new equilibrium. And if it seems shocking, I talked to a lot of coastal engineers who find this shocking to try to take in, I just point out, well, it's been 8,000 years since we've seen this happen, and that's why our levees and our walls aren't designed for this. They're designed for temporary events. Big river floods, storm surges, hurricanes. They're not designed for a new equilibrium relationship between saltwater and freshwater, and that's why they won't do the job. And that $150 billion we may spend in the Bay Area will be money down the toilet, because it's going to have to be combined with a lot of pumps to keep this all from happening. Let me show you how that works in Miami. This is an image from October of water coming right up through a manhole, and this is the source of the flooding that they're coping with. It is coming over some seawall edges, but it's primarily coming up through the drains. And everything our profession has put in place to take away stormwater is going to be the preferred pathway for groundwater to come up into urban space. So you just made it, you gave it an easy path, and it's coming up. So we made a map. There was no map of groundwater, this kind of groundwater in the Bay Area, and we made a map to show where it's really shallow. All those red and orange areas, the groundwater is within 2 meters of the surface. The red areas, it's within 1 meter of the surface. So 1 meter of sea level rise means actual potential for emergent groundwater in all those red areas, all of which are extremely valuable. Every tiny little house is $1 million there now. All of this is extremely valuable. And none of that $100 billion is going to make a difference to this dynamic. No one believed me, so we had to get it peer-reviewed and published in a scientific journal. What we're finding is that the maps show the extent to which seawater is going to cause flooding with groundwater. That's shown here in this little excerpt in the purple. That makes sense, right? Seawater comes up, it's got groundwater on top of it. They're mixed. There are places where it'd be seawater only. Those are exceptions, and that indicates groundwater is already being pumped there. The only reason that's only going to be salt water is because there are pumps that are active, and they're removing the fresh water, and they'll have to get bigger and bigger to keep up. And then all those red areas are places where groundwater is going to cause flooding, even if we build a levee. In fact, all of the purple areas, groundwater is going to cause flooding even if we build a levee. So this is just the beginning of us getting our heads around it. We have about 8,000 hectares of land vulnerable to saltwater flooding with 1 meter of sea level rise. We have an additional 10,000 hectares vulnerable to groundwater flooding alone. That's a lot of land, $1 million a parcel. So do you. You have a lot of land that's vulnerable. This is a 2013 map of Christchurch's groundwater level as it stood in 2010. And we're right there in that first little bend of the Avon, see where it's got a blue zone inside that little bend, the first bend that they've mapped there on that plan? And there's the view from the Crown Plaza, looking down at the foundations of the old PwC building, full of water. Oh, that's groundwater, yes, aha. Next to the Avon, right there in that blue zone where the map showed it would be high. So it's here, and it's coming up. This is from my last trip out to New Brighton when I was here a couple of years ago. This poor woman, I hope she's not in the room. It's always possible, right? She's trying to clear out, this is a storm surge, it's a extra high tide day, and she was trying to clean out the drain to get that puddle to drain away. That puddle was water coming from the bay, so that's the ocean, which has made its way down to her spot there, mixing with water coming up the storm drain. And there she is, trying to clear it out. She's trying to clear out the ocean in the gutter of her street. That's not going to work. I didn't have the heart to tell her. But that's how this is going to start. You're seeing already what Miami is seeing, and it's the same on the edge of Monks Bay on the main road section of Christchurch. Same kinds of things are already happening. And your national study from 2017 says it's going to cause more liquefaction. So we talked about lateral spreading in one of the other presentations. That's what we're headed for, is more areas vulnerable to seismic events. That matters a lot to me coming from the Bay Area because we're sitting in a place that's waiting for an 8.5. My town, Berkeley, is waiting for the 8.5 on the Hayward Fault. Cities like Seattle are waiting for a 9. So we're in the same boat, and we need to learn from each other. And let me tell you something, when the Dutch come and want to be your consultants, they don't know jack about earthquakes. They don't even know anything about biodiversity, never mind earthquakes. So we need to think this through, talking to other regions that are really vulnerable to the same kinds of things. We can't build in conventional ways in places where the groundwater table is rising. It is one of the most important variables in whether or not those structures would survive a seismic event, whether the soil will behave like a liquid. So I want to show you what some other people have done, including the Dutch, and I'll pick up on some of what they've shown you quickly, and then show you what we're doing in the Bay Area very briefly, one example of what we proposed in a competition called the Resilient by Design Challenge. And what I think that design can do is really activate people's sense of courage, of bravery. Monuments are a great example of how we do that in design, reminding people to be brave. Expanded compassion, which Julie Bargman talked a lot about. How do we expand our compassion from our own time to past times? How do we expand that compassion to other social groups or to the future generations? But I'm going to be focusing on shared resourcefulness, which I think examples like the canals of Amsterdam are all about. They dug the canals, putting the material on the blocks in between the canals. The canals are closer together where the pumps were just windmills, and then as the pumping power increased with diesel fuel and electrification, they could put the canals farther apart, and they would still be able to pump the water out of the intervening blocks. So this is a really old way to live with a high groundwater table, and it's quite beautiful. Most people find it an amazing thing to live near the water. Canals don't have to be that big to function either. They can be much smaller if you don't have to get around by boat. Now the Dutch are looking at floating in terms of floating houses. This is in the Waterbeurt experimental district of Eiburg in Amsterdam, and this is an affordable housing project. This was designed with subsidies and rather inexpensive materials, using houses that use the lower third floor as the pontoon, so it's a livable space. That's what it looks like from the air. All those structures on the water are floating. The ones along the levee have conventional foundations, and the walkways are attached. Those are on piers. And the Dutch can do those conventional foundations, that bar building, the buildings along the levee, because they don't have earthquakes. They can get away with relatively cheap conventional foundations for those buildings right next to water. This is my personal favorite one, though. This is at Nesselande near Rotterdam, and it's an excavated artificial pond where they put new luxury housing in this pond. The pond functions as a stormwater wet pond. So, I mean, get this, right? They put rich people in a stormwater wet pond, and they paid to be there. I think we can do this in the United States. I can sell this, absolutely. And the best thing about it in the US would be that those rich people are the ultimate monitoring system. If they see something going wrong, I don't need a drone, I just need some rich people living in my pond, they will immediately call. So I want to go to what Rich Haig taught me. Rich Haig is a landscape architect, was a landscape architect in the United States, recently passed away, and he said, the essence of landscape architecture is to dig hole, make mound. So there you go. I think we all agree about that. And what we talked about doing was excavating artificial ponds, then building the kinds of wide wetland wedges that we need to build in the Bay Area to continue to be an estuary that provides habitat. So we're talking about digging a hole, making a levee, not so much a mound, making a wide eco-dike, and then floating things in the pond, and maybe being able to afford conventional foundations only if we go high. This cartoon doesn't show how high that building would have to be to justify the cost of deep foundations. But these are the kinds of drawings that came out of our competition work. Now I'm talking about work done with the team called the ABC team. I'll show you at the end, but these drawings aren't what I would choose. I would have chosen something a little more like Julie Bargman's armature of industry and streets. This is an old industrial landscape. But it does show you, give you a better sense, I think, of what would happen. Oh yeah, if we floated 3- and 4-story prefabricated units on shared decking, kind of like a snowshoe, to get more buoyancy in these ponds. Now, this is the ultimate seismically appropriate foundation, because if you put enough of this on the surface of a pond, it's going to baffle any sesh movement in the pond, and it's going to be stable and much cheaper than trying to build foundations down to bedrock. So this is what we proposed for East Oakland. We had to do a lot of explanation through physical modeling to tell people that it was going to float, because apparently people think things only float in Europe because they use the metric system, so that's going to matter. So we had to explain floating. We're still explaining floating. And this is the kind of drawings that the architects made to try to explain this. Everybody's kind of coming at this from their own direction. And this is get this to work, there it goes. This is what some of those places might look like at low tide, as the water's rising to mean tide, as the water comes up to high tide. All that white is shared decking that's floating on pontoons below, and then stacked prefabricated units. And then at some point you get to 3 feet of sea level rise. You can see the landscape armature is starting to fray a little bit at that point. For a seismic area, that kind of narrow levee may not be sustainable. And then when we got to about 6 feet of sea level rise, a little under 2 meters, we're worried that this wouldn't work. So the idea is, to go back to Rich's comment, fill those ponds, move new ponds inland, and turn the old ponds into wetlands that'll continue to sustain the wetland habitat of the bay. So it's like rolling up the carpet in phases as we back off from the shoreline. It's managed retreat, but it's also adaptation in place. And you can sell that to a lot of people when you combine them both. Now, our clients in East Oakland were not an easy sell on this, because they saw all that new housing. So low income, mostly minority neighborhoods, they saw this new housing as displacement, as gentrification. So we had to make another case with them and really work out what their needs were. It came late in the competition, so it took a lot of doing. I'm going to share another physical model we did, and then Jen, I'm going to wrap up shortly after that. This model shows, students made a model that would show how a canal could help an existing neighborhood stay longer, inserting a new canal in the street network. And they're showing water rising on both sides. On the right side, there's a canal in their model. On the left side, no canal. And as that groundwater comes up, it intersects the canal. You can see it in the canal, and then they've cut a little hole in their plexiglass, and it starts to drain out. So the groundwater isn't rising anymore on the right side of the model, but it's still rising on the left side without the canal. So we've been taking models like this around to community meetings, engaging people in helping us, kids, grown-ups, pour the water in, test it all, see how it works, and helping people understand in a very kind of common sense way how these things work and why they might want to think about canals as a way to maintain existing structures as long as possible where they are. But we're really talking about maybe 20 years, 30 years, depending on which roller coaster ride we bought our ticket for. And this is a student sketch of what we might do in those spaces where we needed to, for their sake, we needed to insert new housing, ADUs, our accessory dwelling units. We're talking about doing that a lot in the Bay Area to add small housing units that the homeowner can make a profit off of as a way to build wealth and build housing stability when there's so much pressure for people to have to move out or live in tents, which is very, very common now. A lot of tents, sidewalk tents, everything. And this particular take is starting to show the groundwater in that canal and how it might fluctuate, and think about how much pumping would be required to keep it. And we thought we could use this technique to get to about 1.5 meters of sea level rise. And we hope that's a long time. And if it's not a long time, then the next step would be to excavate these areas that have been cut by canals and turn them into excavated ponds and bring in the capital we'd need to live in those places, sometimes using structures like land trusts where we could actually set what the rent would be using a land trust instead of using the conventional market rate development that has been so difficult to accommodate to make work with lower income neighborhoods in the Bay Area. So we're looking at these ideas now in a community called Marin City and working with a similar kind of client and hoping that by showing them what the future is with groundwater, they'll have a much better sense of what their choices are and how to advocate for themselves with the civil engineers who are telling them it's all about the salt water. And it's not all about the salt water. It's really all about the groundwater first and then the salt water for places that are flat next to the coast like Christchurch. And that was our team for the competition. Thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it.